So if you've watched my channel for any amount of time, you know that one of my biggest bugbears, my biggest hatreds, are the think tanks. The think tanks who control our discourse, who continue to control our discourse so that talking points that nobody actually cares about, but people in our little journosphere, in our little inbred, entirely insular journalism sphere, just repeat Tufton Street talking points because that's what our journalists care about, the kind of things that they're told to care about and people like that, rather than talking about real issues. So it means the terms of the discourse by people who are not indeed people who care about real policy proposals and real solutions to the problems that face the general public, the tone and the parameters of the debate are set by people with a very specific agenda. So one of the agendas that the right are pushing, so people like defund the BBC, who are of Tufton Street outfit, is this idea that the BBC is biased. Now, whilst I don't necessarily think that that is entirely untrue, I think there are certain biases that you can point to within BBC coverage. What they talk about when they mean BBC bias is this idea of it being too woke, it being captured by cultural Marxists and leftoids, rather than just very slight biases towards social liberalism and fiscal conservatism, but not even like a large bias, a very, very teeny tiny little bias, which I think is fine. That's an inevitable thing you're going to get with any institution. But it's not a huge, it's a very, very small bias. I really want to make it clear that I'm not denigrating the BBC when I say this. There are some issues that we've had recently with bias because of the fact that the Tories have put their cronies in charge of the BBC, which undermines it as a public broadcaster, who have literally been trying to change the way they do broadcasting to make it more right-wing. In fact, trying to scale back the investigations part of Newsnight because they kept investigating the wrong people, essentially. The right-wing don't like it when you do investigations because it finds out that right-wing people are entirely part of what's going on behind the scenes, and so Newsnight investigating them is bad, turning into topical debates. So you get this part where one of the problems I have with BBC bias is the need to look balanced even though certain arguments have no merit, and that happened a lot during the Brexit debates, for example, where points were given due prominence despite the fact that they were not the same levels of evidence to support them, but they were treated as equals because they wanted to be perceived to be non-biased, when sometimes you have to be biased to present facts the way that they are in terms of what facts have the most evidence to support them. There's legitimate grievances to have with a state broadcaster being an arm of the state, but just like every single media outlet, you always have to understand what kind of position they are taking when they make their reporting and factor that into how you deal with that coverage. That's always been the thing. But having a state broadcaster to be able to fight against private broadcasters is really, really important, and I will always support the BBC as a institution in this country. Because the reason why the right wing want to undermine the BBC is because they want to have de facto control over all of the terms of the media debate in the country. And they can't influence the BBC as a state broadcaster, but they can influence private companies. Now, Sky News is owned by Comcast, so it's not Rupert Murdoch, but it is still in terms of private interests. And they have been just asking people about the perception of BBC bias here. Now, fair play to Kay Burley, she does push back in this clip, but look at what the Culture Secretary, Lucy Fraser, can set the terms of this debate, which again, it's something that's being had in terms of fringe internet politics, but during our cost of living crisis, during the time in which they are biased because they literally have Tory donors being put front and centre in terms of who chooses what programming happens, really and truly, that's where BBC bias comes from. Anyway, let's watch.
They're being heard.
Do you think the BBC is biased?
Well, I am looking at this from the point of view of the Culture Secretary.
Yeah,
and
that's why I'm asking you.
And
so do you think they're biased?
And the evidence shows that there is a perception of bias in relation to the BBC.
What do you think? Do you think, as Culture Secretary, that the BBC is biased?
I think that on occasion it has been biased, yes.
In relation to what?
Well, this report isn't about incidents, but we have seen recently that it's had to apologise for its own reporting, for example, in relation to the attack in the hospital in Israel, so in Gaza.
Love the little Freudian slip there. Oh, the hospital in Israel. Actually, no, not Greater Israel. Actually, it's Al Ahli Hospital in the Gaza Strip. A little Freudian slip there. But even so, plenty of people got things wrong about the Al Ahli Hospital bombing. It wasn't necessarily, it wasn't even a bombing. It was a misfired rocket from PIJ anyway. Like, it wasn't even deliberate. But even so, lots of people got these things wrong, not just the BBC. And that's not evidence of bias, that's just misreporting.
Actually mistaken bias, surely.
Well, there is a perception amongst the public that the BBC is biased. And as Culture Secretary, it's important that I look at that. I must say, these are issues that I have discussed with the BBC. They've taken
but I'm
on
asking you
board.
about the evidence of bias. Where's the evidence?
The evidence of bias is what audiences believe is the content.
No, that's not evidence. Evidence of bias is when you can clearly show they took an editorial line on a contentious issue which has multiple different perspectives that have equal amount of evidentiary bases to them. You can't prove it because it very, very rarely actually happens in reality, right? You want to talk about actual BBC bias? Remember when they did these pictures of Rishi Sunak as Superman or Jeremy Corbyn as Voldemort? This seems pretty biased to me, but these are single instances in a broader landscape of coverage, which usually is pretty good in terms of the way in which that it's less biased than the private networks, because it is a state-owned broadcaster. Again, you have to take this into account when you look at their coverage, but really and truly, it's done pretty well in broad terms with the way in which it covers current events. If anything, the bias that is evident in the BBC, let's say in terms of its fiscal conservatism, is not a function of the BBC at all. It's a function of British journalism more broadly. There's a reason why the BBC's journalists' attitude to things such as whether or not government borrowing is good or not, because they keep thinking that government borrowing is bad. They have their own internal report showing that their journalists don't know enough about economics to put forward the case why borrowing might be a good thing, for example. I mean, Faisal Islam's been better on this than most journalists, but the vast majority of journalists within our entire journalism sphere all just take kind of monetarist dogma because that's what they were taught at PPE at Oxford, and then they just report on it like it's fact. But that's not a BBC problem. They just draw on the same pool of journalists as everybody else does. So you can't mark that down as an evidence of BBC bias and not just British journalism bias.
Of the BBC and
but that's
how
perception,
they...
that's not evidence. That's perception.
That is evidence. That is evidence. That is impartiality.
She knows that she's making shit up. She knows that she's getting cooked here. It's really funny.
Is about perception of the things that are being broadcast by the BBC, and the evidence in relation to that perception is that
perception and evidence are different things.
The evidence from Ofcom, having done studies and questionnaires of the public, is...
I mean, the fact that even having this debate is really, really silly. Really, really silly. But at least Kay Burley is pushing back.
That the BBC's ratings in relation to impartiality have gone down. And I and the BBC think that there is more that the BBC can do in order to improve that.
Which other...
So she didn't answer the question. She had no claims of bias. But of course, not only do the think tanks influence the discourse because it's what the journalists want to talk about, the Conservative Party is full of astroturfing by all of these think tanks like Policy Exchange, the Institute for Economic Affairs, to name just a couple. Now, there's a reason why I've brought up specifically Policy Exchange and specifically the Institute of Economic Affairs. So who in chat here and watching at home, who in chat has heard of a Restore Trust? Because Restore Trust are an organisation that is essentially just a astroturf lobby group where the directors are Neil Record, the chairman of the IEA, a Tufton Street outlet, known for advising Liz Truss to crash the economy, big fans of those. And the other one is Zudita Gebriohannis, who is a Boris Johnson appointment to a trustee of the Victoria Albert Museum. And she herself currently is a senior researcher for the Legatum Institute, who are the people who literally fund GB News, a Conservative Party propaganda outlet that try, again, set the terms of the debate so people talk about what they want them to talk about and not the actual issues facing our country at the moment. And on top of that, look who she used to work for. Oh, it's the Policy Exchange think tank. Oh, isn't that weird how this group who want to essentially get elected into positions on the National Trust board to de-woke it, essentially. Their point of view is that the National Trust is too woke. Isn't it weird how they're astroturfed by people from Policy Exchange, by the people who fund GB News, by the people who literally advised Liz Truss, and then had people who were from the Institute of Economic Affairs appointed to the honours list by Liz Truss as well. Literally, it's just a gigantic astroturfing scheme to try and set the terms of the debate. And the reason why I bring up Sky News specifically in the segment about Lucy Fraser is that they literally brought up the same thing about the National Trust to Steve Reed on Politics Hub 2 hours ago. Right, so this is them specifically talking about being too woke, essentially, quote unquote, which is only part of the national discourse because Policy Exchange and the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Legatum Institute, who are backed up by huge amounts of dark money from the worst people in the world, get to set the terms of the debate and push these issues into being talked about on the news, even though nobody else is talking about it other than them. They set the terms of the debate. Let's listen.
The other thing that we mentioned is the National Trust. There was a bit of a row about whether or not they should put up signs explaining British heritage links to slavery. Say, for example,
there was a row. There was no row. Decided to disseminate into the public discourse using their astroturfing funds. The row was these people who got all of this dark money decided that it was bad, and then because they have power and influence, made it part of the national discourse.
At Winston Churchill's house. Do you back the National Trust in doing that?
Well, I don't think you can just elide from history the bits we don't like. The history, good or bad, is what makes our country what it is today. Every country has a history that's a mixture of good and bad. I'm immensely proud to be British. I think we have a really positive history. I think we make a positive contribution to the world. But that doesn't mean I'm afraid to talk about the bits I might not be agreeing with. These are facts. And I don't think it hurts us to know those because...
And this is a really good answer. I can't believe I'm going to heap praise on Steve Reed here. This is a fine answer by saying, you know, there's plenty of good that the UK has done, but we can't just airbrush our past by just completely ignoring colonialism and things like the slave trade, which we had a large part in. I think this is a fine answer if you're a politician to say, no, we should be talking about these things. We can't just ignore them. We can't just airbrush out of history, which is what Restore Trust want to do. Their part of de-woking the National Trust is by saying that it's bad that they mention that so much of the things that we take for granted in terms of our national heritage and culture were funded through the things that we did badly throughout the course of the slave trade, throughout the course of colonialism. But that's too woke for these people, and that's literally the only reason they find. I can't believe they're being woke as to try and talk about the reality of these, as Steve Reed points out, facts. These facts these people don't like. But I'm sorry, Tufton Street. I'm sorry, Legatum. I'm sorry, Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm sorry, Policy Exchange. But facts don't care about your feelings. Luckily, Restore Trust didn't win any seats multiple times when they tried to get elected onto the National Trust board, but they're coming for all of our institutions. It's exactly what we were talking about before, about Tories wanting to undermine institutions there outside of their political power, and they form lobby groups, they ally with think tanks, they take dark money to try and usurp these institutions to ensure they work in their benefit, and it's really important that we point this out. They then try and usurp the control. It's deeply authoritarian and we need to push back. And we can't just have people like Sky News and our idiotic journalist class just absorbing think tank propaganda and then regurgitating it completely uncritically. For more information, there is a really great video about think tanks' influence on our democracy by Tom Nicholas, and you should watch it. I will link it in the description later on. But my god, this is embarrassing. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.